What's the single best activation when you've seen or had yourself?
This is definitely recency bias. I always get excited about the most recent ones, but this was an advisory client that they switched their static onboarding, like having kind of a classic questions, walking you through, showing you what you can do in the app, to an AI onboarding where it was asking you like about 8 questions. It was quite skeptical around it, but they basically saw that it took people 3 times as long to complete it. So you'd think it completely would drop off, but more people actually completed it, and the ARPU was more than 10x after day 14.
My name is Jacob Rushfin, founder and CEO of Botsy and the host of Price Power, the podcast for subscription apps to grow their revenue. Today, we're talking with Daphne Tideman. Daphne is a growth advisor and consultant for wellness apps and all around product led growth superstar. Today, we talk about why onboarding completion is often a vanity metric that hides activation failures, how to identify whether your retention problem is actually an activation problem, why action versus no action comparisons overstate the value of weak activation metrics, how to build mini aha moments into onboarding before the paywall, and much more.
Super excited to have you joining on the Price Power podcast today. Today, we are talking about activation.
Thanks for having me. Excited to dive in.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about is that, you've transitioned to a lot of different things in your career, started more in different agencies, moved to e-commerce. Um, how do you think about activation earlier in your career compared to now?
Yeah, so I think I could almost think of it as it being more 2D versus 3D as it is now. Like when I started out, I was 21. I was just getting into growth and learning as I was going, working with different startups at the agency. And it was almost like activation was just super simple. Like, oh, it's kind of that step that, they've signed up, taken some kind of action. It was almost just a step in the funnel versus like over time seeing it as more like behavioral and action based, and really thinking of it as being a bit more nuanced than just a step, but more that there's different forms of activations and ways to activate, and also quality of activation. And then when I shift to heights, it's obviously very different than when you're in e-commerce because you don't actually know if people are using your product. So your best measure of activation is like, okay, are they actually renewing past that first period? But if that period's quite long, it's kind of like, well, what is activation then? Is it that they've just, are we almost equating it with acquiring them and ignoring it as a step? Or, because if they've got a year subscription, is then that 1 year renewal point? But what we did see there was that the monthly subscribers did teach us a lot about like who was and wasn't activating and what their reasons were, and also learned to see like, hey, a lot of people think of activation as like working on that step, but most of what we did that impacted activation was more upfront around how we were communicating, creating benefit. It was a supplement, so it takes a while to feel the benefit. So having like benefit timelines, talking about habit stacking it with your morning coffee, and that really like started making activation a bit more 3D for me, that it's not just this one simple step, it's not just one action, it's much more impacted by everything that happens up front. um, and I think that's also like now when I'm advising and consulting with apps, it's like so much more layered than in ecom because we can measure this data. And that's also, to be honest, I think why I love it so much more these days is because I'm like, give me the data, let me see the insights. And there's different layers and moments that make up activation. So I think it's just gone from 2D to almost 4D in terms of my thinking of it, and become a lot more nuanced than just, hey, they actually, used a product or signed up.
And the huge differences from e-commerce subscription apps, where a lot of subscription apps you really have user behavior and kind of what are people doing in the product, how do they interact with things, how do they perceive things. um, do you think there were mistakes early on that you think others can avoid?
I think the main mistake is oversimplifying it or just assuming you know what action is best. I think sometimes we have this is what they should do versus this is what actually helps them activate. And I think the other thing is like because we want it as early on, we sometimes choose something that has a lower correlation or a lower predictive power. So I think that's also something where it's like the easiest metric isn't always the best metric. And obviously, you want it to be easy enough to measure. You don't want to overcomplicate it and make it a combination of 10 different actions that aren't realistic or a subsection. But I think like what I would do now is much more understand the nuances of like what is kind of volume or like the right kind of action and when, versus just treating it as like only just the action. I think I didn't also consider enough like the importance of timing of these things. And short isn't always better for sure, but like it does have an impact into terms of like how much does that actually predict retention.
Yeah, yeah. And so I guess it's a good segue in terms of like what made you realize that the standard activation metrics everyone was tracking weren't actually predicting the things that mattered, where you talk about predictive power. How did you kind of figure that out?
Yeah. So I do a lot of growth audits and I absolutely love them because it just I get to go in and be nosy about order data. It's great. I love diving into all the different data and seeing everything. And there'll be these cases where I was like, onboarding looks good. Trial started, looks good. There's a decent feature adoption. But why are people not retaining? The price isn't crazy. And it made me start to realize like, hey, the like just like this idea of like, hey, if users do this versus they didn't do this, that seems to retain better. It was just oversimplifying, and that those metrics could still look good, but you could still have a potential activation issue because it could be that they are taking action, but not enough. It could be that they are taking the wrong actions or they're not getting into the habit of actually using the product. And I think that's what made me realize like that we sometimes kind of correlate behaviors and we're like, oh, there's a correlation with this. If they do this, they're retaining better. So that must be the activation. But that doesn't mean it's causation. And so any action will always be no action. If they're taking some kind of action, that retention curve will always look better because at least, unless it's a terrible action, but like most of the time, but that it's finding that sweet spot in terms of like between volume and impact of that action and which actions matter more, and also understanding their users. So I realized it wasn't predicting what mattered when the metrics that said activation should be okay were good, but we were still not retaining users and they were dropping off early on. They were dropping off, in the first like 30 days and not later on.
Yeah, I think, from my experience, a lot of teams maybe go, oh, onboarding completion. They completed
Yeah.
onboarding, they're activated, right? And that's not always the case. I know you were talking about a case where, onboarding completion for, both iOS and Android was over
Yeah.
90%. But then when you looked at the data, you were saying that most users were gone by day two.
Yeah. So sometimes you have like an onboarding that's like very short and quick to click through. And that was the case there. It was like a very easy onboarding, low cognitive load, answer a few simple questions. And like, I think people were almost completing it because they're like, what is this? How does it work? I'm curious. Like, so the desire was there at them, but then they were getting there and they were like, now what? And it was actually quite a complex product. So having this short onboarding was actually doing them a disservice because yeah, they were getting the insights as to who these people were, but they weren't actually helping them to that point. And then it was really overwhelming for those people to try and do their whole setup. Like they'd go through the onboarding and be like, okay, do you want to, start a trial? Some people would start a trial just out of curiosity, but then they still had to do so much that it was almost like, okay, just leave it. And I think like we need to like keep in mind that like completing questions doesn't mean experiencing value. Too many onboardings I see are like just a few questions and I'm just like, okay, great, you know who they are. But or like there's one question they're like, we've personalized our experience based on you. I literally saw an app do this today when I was testing an app. I was like, you haven't personalized it. Personalized is not one question with 5 options. um, but and we try to rush and get that metric up. But I think at the result of it is we aren't actually helping them feel. So what we ended up doing is making that onboarding longer, building in already kind of some of those steps into that point already before getting them to the paywall so they could start to feel the value, and then completion dropped, but the retention improved as a result.
Yeah, it's kind of like, when you're looking and thinking about email marketing, you
Yeah.
have, click rates or open rates. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, these are all vanity metrics, right? And I think,
Yeah.
a lot of people understand that concept of vanity metric. And
Yeah.
sometimes onboarding completion is a similar vanity metric where you're completing onboarding isn't the goal.
No. Exactly. It's a means to end. And even trial starts, in my opinion, is also a bit of a vanity metric because sometimes you try to make it so easy to start a trial or so attractive, like by you're like, oh, if we make it longer, the trial starts went up. Okay, let's do that. But I've had that also as a case where, we made it longer, trial starts went up, but the actual amount of people who converted in the end was lower because people just procrastinated and were like, oh, I've got longer to try this out, and they don't try it out as a result.
How do you think about like what that right activation metric is? Of course, it's different for every app, and you're trying to balance this activation versus monetization, where so many subscription apps, you are starting a trial before they're actually experiencing the product. How do you think about like balancing that activation versus monetization? Is activation secondary? Is yeah, how do you think about that?
So I would argue that in most cases, if I see a monetization and an activation problem, I would go for the activation problem because the monetization will more naturally follow. Now, there's
Mm.
exceptions to that where maybe the monetization problem is a pricing or package mismatch. But most of the time, if I then go into the data of like, hey, why are people churning or like, complaining, it's often not enough usage. And that's another reason then I'm like, hey, let's start with the activation side of it. What I would say is like, there's a difference, and this is also more relevant, I would say, also for freemium apps, is like there's a difference between an activated user that's paying versus an activated user that's not paying. So if you want to make sure that improving activation is driving monetization, you want to really focus in on those paying users. If you want to use activation to drive more to referral and drive a bigger user base, then you're focusing more on those free users. And this is oversimplified, but that would be the general kind of feeling of that. And then I would also look at speaking to those users who have paid for a while, who have retained for a while, and trying to understand what their journey was and what they were doing in the beginning, to really make sure that we're driving the right kind of users to make sure that we're seeing activation as a thing that's going to drive monetization.
Yeah, where they're connected in the sense that, maybe an activation is input. If users are successfully understanding the value of the product, that
Yeah.
usually correlates with better monetization,
Yeah.
better conversion rates. Yeah, I think it makes
Yeah.
sense.
I've almost always seen a positive impact on monetization as a result of the activation because it's having a ripple effect on retention, on your ability to win people back, on willingness to pay. Like often also because I also treat it as part of the onboarding of like my job is to activate them even before they've signed up for a trial, signed up for a paid account, is that you then end up seeing like, hey, there are more people who are actually starting than a paid account. And so it usually does have a really positive impact if you work on that. And then if you've done that and monetization is still on the lower end, or there's some fundamental flaw in the setup, that's when I would start to focus a bit more on the monetization side.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think about, it sounds like you're talking about activation kind of spans through pretty much the entire
Yeah.
new user experience, right?
Yeah.
And so do you think about like incorporating some aha moments in that onboarding
Yeah.
flow before, a paywall, and then can try to continue that activation journey after the paywall?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest pushbacks is like, oh, it's really hard to have an aha moment in the onboarding because it's like from a technical perspective, it can be difficult to do that. So like from a workout app, for example, trying to build in that into the onboarding, hoping that they're at the moment that they can do a workout, that can be quite tricky. So what I try to do is I try to not treat aha moments as like one big thing, but try to think of mini moments of understanding whether or not they see the value in a smaller way through like a smaller action, or if they have a feeling that like, okay, I can see myself in this and this is a good like a good app for me. So like for example, Ladder I think does this really well because in their ads they show you kind of like that outcome of like what you want to see as a result of following them. So you already have like a little aha moment of like, hey, I see myself in this person and this is my problem and what I want to achieve. And then in the onboarding, as you're filling in like, hey, this is how often I work out, this is what I do. That's like super simple. And it's the same screen for everyone because I've extensively tested that onboarding. But it's just like oh, Ladder was made for people like you. And so I see those as like mini little aha moments that you want to build into your ad and also your onboarding. I think Opal, the Focus app, does also a really cool one of this where it's like, I think it's a bit too gimmicky in my opinion. It's like, but like you block your first thing or you do this first action and you get this giant gem exploding and it's meant to make you feel good in that onboarding. Um, and that's not the actual usage of them as a focus blocking app. It's just already getting you a feeling that, hey, I'm starting to take control of my focus. So I think,
Yeah.
yes, you have to have those moments, but you have to have like smaller, more frequent moments rather than getting caught up on we have to get them to do the big thing.
I like that concept of multiple moments, and it's you don't have to accomplish it all at once. It builds up,
Yeah.
and you talked about. I want to go back to you talked about bringing the aha moment into
Yeah.
ads. I think that's a super cool concept that we don't usually
Yeah.
think about. We think about activation, aha moments as products specifically. Um, how do you like? How do you do this well? If you
I
bring
think
that into the ad,
so. I think it's like showing the job to be done in the creative and showing the transformation. I think that's one of the most powerful ways of doing that. So, an example I use a lot is Mimo, the coding app. Like, Ekaterina, when she was working there, said that one of their best performing ads was um, when someone was just showing that they were coding in a lift. And so you can see then, hey, they're coding in a lift. They're actually finding time to do this. This is what I've been struggling to find time to do. So I think that's a really good example of like showing them what that outcome could look like. And if that outcome is less tangible to see or is harder to see, can you have someone talk about it? Or can you maybe have, like, for example, kind of like a testimonial which talks about, like, hey, this is what I had, or can you show like a before or after? Can you show some kind of form of the difference that makes them trust in the process that you're going to give them that transformation? Because every single app we use, at the end of the day, we have something we want to achieve with them. And our biggest reason of like, should I pay for this is because we aren't sure if it's going to do it for us. We aren't sure if we can trust them to deliver on the value. And when you show upfront in the ad already, we can deliver on this value and we manage to do that for others, that's when you start to be willing to like take more time to get to know them.
yeah, I think that's important concept to think about in terms of it often boils down to simple human emotions,
Yeah.
like in terms of trust. Can you? I guess it's trust and emotion. I don't know, but it kind of is. It's
Anxiety
a
without
feeling.
trust. Anxiety
Yeah, yeah,
without
right. The
it.
opposite. The
Yeah.
opposite. But can you make people trust your product? Can you make people trust you could actually deliver on that value? And
Yeah.
can you make them feel something? Can you make
Yeah.
them think that's can they picture themselves using the product before actually using it?
Yeah. And I think which angle you take and how you do that effectively really depends on what emotions are your audience going through in that moment. And I harp on about doing just user interviews, and it's because there's no way you're going to find this from just a survey. Like, I've had such like emotional user interviews where someone's opened up and talked about what were they struggling, because I work with wellness. So a lot of the times it's, they might actually be struggling with like chronic um anxiety or insomnia, and what caused that is quite emotional. And then asking them about like, hey, when you're looking for these solutions, what were you feeling? You can understand from the emotions they're feeling how to then give them that reassurance. Because I think sometimes we're like, oh, we just need to give them social proof, or oh, we just need to show them, it works. But actually, like, understanding which emotions holding them back helps you create more that aha moment, because it helps them speak to, like, that you're speaking to what they're struggling with.
Yeah, I think I say this a lot, but humans are emotional creatures, kind of pretending to be rational.
Yeah.
Understand the psychology. Really, understand your users. What are you solving for them? What are they feeling? And we, myself included, get. I love the numbers. I love the quantitative
Yeah.
side. But at the end of the day, it's people on the other side of the screen. They don't care about conversion rates and metrics. They have something they're trying to figure out and
Yeah.
solve that ties to a real need. And I think that's such an important thing that is often forgotten when we're going, oh, did you improve your trial to start rate by 5%? And yeah, so I like that a lot.
Exactly. It's
Um,
easy to get caught up on the quick things, but it doesn't have to be time consuming to go out there and talk to people. I've often done it in a week, and it's always been impactful and made major changes as a result.
I think to double down on that doesn't have to be time consuming. People have said that after about 5 user interviews, you probably have a good spectrum of what pretty much everybody is saying. That you don't need to do
Yeah,
tons and tons, and you can get that information
exactly.
pretty quickly. Cool. So, you know, ultimately, activation isn't what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve retention and usage and
Yeah.
long-term habits. I know that you mentioned that a lot of times you started telling teams that your retention problem is actually an activation problem.
Yeah.
We think about that we need better retention for our app, but retention starts at the very beginning. What were
Yeah.
people's reactions when you started telling them that?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's they're like open to it, of course, and there's other times where they kind of feel like, oh, we still need to get this feature in place first. And it's almost like, no, this feature will solve it, but a feature rarely solves activation, but it feels more tangible than saying, hey, we have an activation, or we need to optimize what we have, or optimize the journey, because that's why a feature rarely solves it, because it's often more about the journey. Then the other thing is like what we've talked about earlier of like, oh, but the onboarding's good, or we're getting a lot of people starting to try, like, starting or going. I've even seen an app I'm looking at right now. They have a really strong like trial started and trial to paid completion rate, but they're still losing people in that first month. So we're still thinking like, hey, there might be something wrong here around activation. And I think that's the thing is like, they think, oh, if these metrics are good, it's not that. And then the other thing is like, it's not even that they don't want to focus on activation instead of retention. My most common one is the shiny thing of acquisition. That's who I'm fighting, because everyone wants to focus on acquisition. It's like, no, we just need more users. And then I like do the calculations. I'm like, you're requiring thousands of users. If we could just get, 20% of those to actually do action, you don't need more users. And even better, your cost of acquisition goes down. How much you're earning on them goes up. It will make acquisition easier. But I think that's the biggest thing that I have to like fight with, is they just want to focus on like the ads and the meta side of it, or like whatever channel they're focusing on. It's often meta, but and I have to fight with that to say like, hey, we do need to focus on activation. And then there's one final thing that I think no one talks about enough, in my opinion, but why do we call it day 2 retention and day 7 retention? It's a really weird phrase, because you're not actually retaining anyone at that point. You're still activating them. Like, I was thinking about it, like for most apps I work with, like activation is probably like a 7 to 30 day thing of getting them into the habit of using it and like really truly getting them committed to the app. But we're all talking about a retention. So of course people think it's a retention problem if you're losing people at day 2.
Yeah, it goes back to kind of the quantitative angle, something you can understand, something you can put on paper versus like
Yeah.
understanding what truly people are experiencing, how people are using your product, and I think that there is that gap, and so this connects to how you're talking about or you differentiate between time to first value
Yeah.
versus time to core value as two
Yeah.
layers of activation. Can you tell me more about that framework?
Yeah, so that's really inspired by the kind of like SaaS product led growth space. I think Wes Bush talks about a similar concept also in his book, but I'm not sure if he's the one who originally came up with it, because it's been cited in different places. But I think it's an interesting framework, just because I don't want to claim credit for something that I haven't invented in any way. The time to first value, that's kind of that initial, like what we were talking about earlier, that mini, like little aha moments where users might not have gotten the full value, but they see that app could help them. It's like, this is for me. This is something that could help me. It's like, what Noom does with a personalized plan and reassuring you throughout the weight loss app, just for those not familiar. They give you a personalized plan. They reassure you throughout it. They ask you questions and teach you things. And those are little moments of perceived value. And they could be action based, but they could also just be learning something. And we want that time to first value really to happen in the first session, and ideally happen quite quickly, that we've built enough trust to keep them going. And then the time to core value, that does take longer. I think for most apps, like it probably does take a few days to get there. And remember, I'm working with wellness apps, so the time to first value to core value is probably slightly longer than some other apps. For some apps, it could be on day 1 already, but it's like usually it's that a user is doing something repetitively and feeling that benefit. So actually, have committed to doing, a meditation or two already, and are starting to notice the difference, and they're really starting to build a habit around it. So like, for example, for Blinkist, the first value could be, oh, you see that you could actually read a book and feel convinced, like, hey, I can actually read a summary and I can make time for this. It's really easy to use, fits into my lifestyle. There's a book that I want to read, and then you're starting to get excited about it. But like the time to core value might be either finishing that first book or having a 3-day streak. And what that core value is or how many times that is a little bit dependent on what actually predicts that retention.
I think breaking those different moments up allows teams to be more focused.
I think it makes it easier to understand that you don't have to have a big thing in the first moment. And it also makes it easier to actually measure the timing of these things and see, like, hey, if the time to core value is too long, we probably need to get them first to the first value a bit shorter and quicker, because usually that's then what's taking too long, that they're not seeing the first value. And we need to shorten that down. And I think it also helps them like kind of break it up into stages versus seeing it as like one flat metric. Because I think that's the other challenge, is like, it isn't just one metric often in activation. There's often like a first step, a second step. And that's what I meant early on with that 2D versus like 3-day thinking, of like realizing like it isn't just this like, hey, we need to do one little thing and they're retained. No, it's usually a few different things and getting them into, you know, a setup where they are actually going to use it. So like, for example, for a time blocking app, the first value might be actually seeing like, hey, I've managed to block everything, get myself set up. This is exciting. Like I can choose exactly what I've been struggling with. I feel like it will actually help me. But then the core value might be having like a first full session, or it might be having 2 sessions. So I think having those different moments helps you understand where you're losing people and what the issue is.
I've often heard and kind of used this myself in terms of like a setup moment,
Yeah.
aha moment, or activation, and then like
Yeah.
habit moment,
Yeah.
ongoing.
Yeah. That's
Is
another
that
phrase
similar?
used often.
Yeah,
Where,
yeah. And so talked a lot about like what how to think about activation metrics, how to influence this, but how do you actually test whether an activation metric is real or vanity or actually influencing anything?
yeah. So this is where having good data tracking is kind of the prerequisite. I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see with this, is that if we're not tracking the right things, and we can't backtrack it, then it's going to take a while before we can get this confidence. But what I'm looking for is like, okay, activated users are retaining significantly better. When we test that across different like cohorts and channels, we understand that like, hey, this is consistent across most of the cohorts, most of the channels. It isn't just like one like high, because sometimes you have it, for example, that users who come through like a strong organic source, like through an influencer that they trust, they might naturally kind of retain better or do a certain action because they've been told to do that, but it's not predictive of all users. And then I'll look at like, okay, does this metric actually also improve the downstream metrics? So what we also talked about, where if they're activated and using, but if they're not paying, that's probably not going to be like helpful. So I think those are kind of the things that I will look for. And then without going on a user interview rampage again, I would say they're also very powerful in kind of like sense checking. Is that also in the user's mind? What matters to them? Is that actually what they perceive as value? Because it might be, I think there's a difference between what you need someone to do to get value out of your app versus what someone sees as value. And both are important, but I would consider like a good activation metric to be also reflective of them getting value, not just you getting them set up.
How do you start, like where do you start here, like in terms of, is it just kind of throwing some different metrics at the wall? Do you have a good formula for kind of starting with these hypotheses?
I think it depends on how much data you have already, how much you're tracking, and um, how much confidence you already have in understanding this. If you don't have much data yet, I wouldn't go and just track everything and then hope that one of them predicts. I would start with the user interviews. Versus if you're already tracking quite a bit, what I would just basically do is a lot of comparisons of like, if they do this versus if they do behavior 1 versus behavior 2, what retains better? If they do behavior 1, okay, behavior 1 seems to be more predictive against all the other behaviors we check. Okay, if they do behavior 1 in 7 days versus 14 days, does that matter? And I trying to work out like, okay, what is actually showing a difference in those downstream metrics will usually help you narrow down that. And then you could, if you're not sure enough or you haven't got that, you kind of user insight, then you can validate that with user interviews. Versus when you don't have the data, it's almost like you'd have to track everything, then wait and see. And that's really going to take a lot of time. And that's not realistic for like, because I work with a lot of startups and scale ups who don't have that luxury of data or time, or like the length of data that they need to see if it's predicting retention. In those cases, what I would actually do then is really double down on those user interviews, and then based on more qualitative data, define what we believe the activation metric will be. Make sure we're tracking that and some of our other hypotheses so that we can start gathering data. And then I would intentionally try to see, can we learn faster who is actually activating or not? And in this case, also kind of controversial take, but I actually think monthly subscriptions are way better than annual subscriptions, because then you're forcing them to, for startups, not for all, but then you're forcing them to think every month whether or not they want to renew, which would then help you learn the difference of like those who do renew and those who don't renew, because it's when they put their money where their mouth is that you're learning, is this actually, someone who's activating and willing to pay versus saying that this is what matters to them, but doing something different.
Because they have to make that decision every single month about,
Yeah.
is your product delivering enough value for me to keep paying for it? Yeah, that's super interesting. And so we start with maybe user research or some kind of throw in some different events at the wall in maybe mixed panel or amplitude, try to understand, does this have any correlation with a retention? So we talked about, or you mentioned this before, in terms of correlation versus causation. How do we get from correlation, hey, these look like they're correlated with retention, to actually causation?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because like there'll always be some kind of correlation with it. I think when we see like on a big enough data group that this does seem to be predictive, and it also matches, I think there's also, to be honest, a bit of common sense of this is like, hey, okay, obviously if they do a trial, like complete the onboarding, they're more likely to retain. But like, what is beyond that common sense of like, okay, we may have not expected that, or that is someone taking a active movement rather than a passive kind of metric. I think that's a key one. And then I would also say like trying to understand at different scales how that impacts also helps reduce that risk of it. So for example, for one app where forming friendships, as in like in connecting with people as friends, is really important. What we saw was like, okay, one friend increases that retention, 3 friends increases that further, 5 friends, 10 friends. But looking at actually then the difference of that, we don't need them to have 10 friends, and the cohort that does that is very small. So we're not trying to get like just, the 2% that does happen to do 10. We know that, hey, actually the sweet spot is around 3 to 5 friends. If they get that, they're more likely to retain. It's also realistic for a big enough group, but there's room for improvement. So I think that's also another sense check that I would do, is like, okay, kind of balancing those two things. And then also sense checking, like, is it even realistic to expect this of someone?
Yeah. So a bit of quantitative analysis, but also some common sense.
Yeah.
What is really realistic for users to do? And then you're kind of talking about, can we get a high enough percentage of new users to do this metric where it actually influences behavior? And I would imagine also there's simply like, if we move this metric, or if we launch experiments that try to move this metric, does retention improve?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's when like you also learn a lot from it, in terms of like, once you actually launch those tests, is this actually making a difference? Like I was talking about this earlier, but with someone where it was like, is quarterly plans actually cannibalizing annuals? Well, let's first find out if people actually know which duration to go with. And if we do tests around explaining like, hey, this is when you need an annual plan, this is when you need a quarterly, because my hypothesis was people don't know which package to go with, because we aren't guiding them in terms of how long to expect to use the app. I was like, well, if we do 1 or 2 experiments around that, and nothing around that is actually having a positive or negative impact on which packages they're going for, then we could potentially test and see like, well, what happens when we remove quarterly? But just removing quarterly up front isn't actually going to solve it, because we don't actually know if the reason they aren't going for annuals is because the quarterly, or because they aren't understanding the value of it, and we need to get that value across first. And I think you learn very quickly with almost one or two like initial experiments, whether or not you seem to be on the right track. Because even if it isn't the right experiment, if it's having some kind of drop, that also tells you a lot that maybe you haven't got the right thing, but it is impacting them. Versus
Yeah.
if you're non-significant, then you might be, if you have enough data, assuming you've done all the pre-calculations, then it might indicate this isn't what's wrong or what matters.
Yeah. And I think other people often get caught up in the fancy quantitative analyses of,
Yeah.
oh, well, it looks like the data says that this is going to happen if this, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
blah. At the end of the day, well, you don't really know if your hypothesis is true or not until you
No,
actually test it and learn and
exactly.
figure out. And that's the point of like, we keep in mind that experiments are mainly for learning, that you want to improve
Yeah.
metrics, sure. But the most important thing is, are you learning, about your users and your
Yeah.
product?
Yeah, the only time it's like, oh, let's do more of that upfront is when you're really small and you don't have the data to run it as an experiment. Then sure, spend a bit more time being more confident upfront. But when you have the luxury of data, there has to be that switch point where you have a strong enough hypothesis and you just go out and test it, because most of those experiments will fail, and that's fine. But like I said, like I learned just as much as from a loss versus a win. And if anything, that even a non-significant, like I know everyone hates on them, but that teaches me a lot too, because assuming I've set it all up correctly, that means that apparently is not something that people are bothered with or like having an impact.
Yep. Yep. I think usually you learn more from a failed experiment
Yeah,
than a successful one. Yeah.
from the learnings.
Um, yeah. So cool. So if someone thinks they might have a retention problem, but suspects it might actually be an activation issue, or someone sees they have a retention problem but suspects it might actually be some activation issue, how do they test this? How do they figure this out?
Yeah, so I would then start to look at like the retention curves and seeing like, okay, where are we losing people? And at which point are they actually dropping off? And also look at this like per subscription type, if there are different ones, and also if there is Android versus iOS, to try and understand compared to like benchmarks and experience. Like we're always going to lose more in the beginning for sure. But is it more than what we'd expect? If someone then had like, let's say they've only got like annual plans, and or lifetime subscriptions or something like that, where you can't really like say much about that because it's like by the point, what we talked about earlier, like after a year, is that still an activation problem? What I would then do is I would try to understand, are people actually active within that subscription, and till what point do they seem to stay active? So I would almost look at it as like, okay, are they active in the beginning but then losing it? Well, that's probably then more a retention problem. Or did they never take action to begin with and haven't been active and are essentially just always been dormant users? Then that's an indication like, okay, this isn't actually a retention problem. So, and then one other thing I would do, which I think also doesn't get looked at enough, is if it does look to be a potential activation problem, I would still also check the acquisition setup to see like, hey, what are they optimizing on if they are running ads, like in terms of the top of the funnel goal? Because sometimes I think that can mislead you to thinking you have an acquisition problem. And also like if they are focusing on like a lot of lower quality users and bringing a lot of those volumes and then muddying the numbers, I would try to like, and that's where that segmentation comes out. I always try to like prove myself wrong rather than right, if that makes sense. And like try to rule out any other reason why this could not be an activation problem, but be one of the other. And there are apps where it is a retention problem, where users were active in the first month or so, but they just trickled off. They stopped using it. They lost like kind of the interest or the motivation. It wasn't new enough, or it wasn't helping them enough. They weren't seeing difference. And that's when I would work on more the habit, like keeping that habit going, and also growing with the user according to how they're changing in that time period to stay relevant.
Do you think it's more frequently an activation problem versus like
Yes.
long-term retention?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is why I harp on about activation, because I'm like, it's just so much more often. Like I think like sometimes, for example, win backs get a lot of attention because they feel really excited. Like we would have completely lost them, and look, we got them back. And these were users who wanted to stop paying or stopped paying, and they came back, and it's like woohoo. But then if you look at the amount of people at that point, you've lost so many. And I think like it's often like the percentage you want back sounds maybe interesting or fun, but like if you compare it relative to the amount of people at the beginning, I think especially with the competition these days, there's so many apps, so many options. Like I know myself when I was looking for like a new recipe app, I just started free trials at the same time, and it was like let made a best app win, and just tested three different ones, and I was like, well, this is the one I actually stuck to and used the most. That's the one I'm gonna keep.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah,
Maybe I
you
just
just
do
like you
that.
said, you can just yeah. I think probably you and I are much more familiar with all the different app options than we think, in that kind of way.
Yeah.
Maybe not everybody does that,
No,
but yeah, when you're talking about the numbers, yeah, it makes sense, right? You go, okay,
yeah.
well, if I can have a 5% win on every single new person in my app, that's clearly more impactful than a 5% win on the 15% of users that are there at day 180 or whatever it
Yeah.
is, and so it's very clear kind of what the usually the larger impact
Yeah.
effort will be.
Yeah, like I said, there's definitely cases where it is a retention problem. And I think where I see that being a bigger issue is when users almost outgrow the app or there's a shorter term use case, in which case it's always like, okay, if they are going for a subscription, is subscription the right model? Or was it always that they were shorter term and we're just not fitting the model to the use case? Or can we somehow show that we're actually growing with them and adjusting what we're offering to them based on how their needs are evolving? Like what is almost like their next level of growth. And I think a good example of this is like with meditation apps like Headspace and Calm. They're constantly creating new content, and also speaking to new, more niche use cases. But what they could do better is doing more regular check-ins of like, hey, is the problem you came to us with still actually your problem? And is this still the right solution for you? Or do we need to push you to different content based on what your needs are?
Yeah, yeah. On the flip side, I see, in terms of the shorter term value, a
Yeah.
lot of the AI apps,
Yeah.
shifting towards weekly plans where,
Yeah.
okay, if we know users aren't going to stay around very
Yeah.
long, we're going to capture as much value as we can up front in the first few weeks, and
Yeah.
then we'll go, okay, I guess that's our business. So
Yeah.
it's not really a long term product. Or
But I think that's also like, it's also okay if it is a short term use case and then your retention is probably also shorter. Like, for example, a dating app. You don't want a annual dating app because that's basically like
right.
you're saying upfront, I don't think I'm going to find anyone in the next year and I'm going to need this app. Or if I find someone, I'm going to keep dating. That's a different use case. That's also fair. But if that's the way you do things, but it's like you wouldn't go for an annual with that because it's almost like setting yourself up for the idea that I'm not going to succeed. And so like I think like retention also like looks different. And that's why I was also thinking about like, oh yeah, these what is the day frame for what is activation versus retention. I do think it really differs per app because for some, like an AI tool, like let's say take Lovable, you might on the first day already build a really cool project and be really proud of that. You might be activated within day one and be like, hey, look, I built this website in like half an hour or like even 10 minutes and I'm really proud of this or this prototype. And then but your lifetime might be a bit shorter because you might not need to build a whole new website every single day. And so their retention framework is very different. And I think Elena Werner, who's there, I don't know her official title, so I'm really sorry if I get it wrong. I think head of growth, high up in
Growth, head
growth,
of marketing, something. Yeah, yeah.
smashing it on the growth side. Even talked about how they removed or like changed the focus of subscription because they were like, that's just not matching our use case. And it was actually annoying people to try and force them to have a certain amount of credits per month because our use case goes in waves. And in those cases, I think we have to think of activation as building enough trust that when they need us, they'll come back, and building in little moments or reminders or like extra use cases to keep them coming back and wanting to use it.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, last question before we move into our lightning round. This is a newly formed section of the podcast, our lightning round. So you'll be the first guest to go through it. You should be honored. Um, but
Yeah.
before that, what's the biggest activation mistake you see subscription apps making right now that they could maybe fix in a single sprint?
So if I'm assuming like I don't like we're just talking generally about like any app. and I don't really know exactly where they're dropping off. I think the biggest activation mistake I see the most often is not having that value moment before a paywall and having that little aha moment in there. And so that would be what I would try to fix because, like I said, it doesn't have to be something super technical. It could just be feeding back in, hey, this is exactly who the app is for, showing more visually, either through a video or like even just screenshots of what the app looks like and how it can help them achieve the goal. That would be where I would probably look to first of like, hey, can we in the onboarding already do that? Versus getting caught up on like push or email, all of that, because I just see those as plasters on the bigger problem.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great advice. Great advice. Okay, so
Our
for
lightning.
our lightning round, get ready. So
Ready.
it's the Price Power
Yeah.
podcast. I have to ask, what's the biggest or most interesting pricing and packaging win you've seen?
I had a really cool case where an audit client came back and they said that their yearly subscriptions had gone from 16% to 39% after they'd originally said, no, we aren't a yearly product. And that was just a result of that better onboarding and positioning of annual in terms of price. I think that's also such a quick win in terms of like relative, like monthly to annual price. And the best part with that increase was that overall paid conversion had also actually doubled from like 6.6% to 13.7%, despite also being a freemium app.
Wow. So get your monthly to annual price ratios right, and that could be a pretty big win.
And yeah, and managing the expectations up front of how long you'll need it for.
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Do you have a hot take that would get pushback from other growth advisors
Other growth advisors. I was thinking client wise.
or anybody? Any hot
Yeah,
takes?
I mean, I've had a few hot takes. I feel like today I said a few controversial things, but I would say revenue is a terrible like North Star metric or a metric to focus on overall. I still see actually also some advisors focusing too much on that. It just makes you optimize for extracting value rather than creating it. So that would definitely be a hot take that I think I shared it today because I'm just like seeing this still so often that when I ask them for a North Star metric, it's like, oh, revenue. I'm like, no.
Yep, yep. I think that's a great one. All right, and then last question: what's the single best activation when you've seen or had yourself?
So this is definitely recency bias. I always get excited about the most recent ones, but this was an advisory client that they switched their static onboarding, like having kind of a classic questions, walking you through, showing you what you can do in the app, to an AI onboarding where it was asking you like about 8 questions. And it was quite skeptical around it, but they did some really cool user testing throughout it, all to really validate that onboarding and the setup. And they basically saw that it took people 3 times as long to complete it. So you'd think it completely would drop off, but more people actually completed it. And the ARPU, which was very low to begin with, was more than 10x after day 14, which for an audience that's hard to monetize, Gen Z, was really good to see.
10x revenues,
Yeah.
pretty crazy.
This
That's
is fun.
huge. Yeah,
Startup scale up. So we get these kind of big numbers. I always love working with smaller companies because it's so much more interesting than like, oh, it improved 2% with the
yeah.
larger ones.
But still, that's
Yeah.
super interesting, and for probably a strong signal for others to try out kind of AI chat onboarding flow, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. More
Cool.
interactive onboarding, I think, is the principle behind it.
That's yeah, great advice. Well, this was awesome. I really appreciate you joining, Daphne. I think there's so many great insights to unpack for everybody. Anything you would like to promote or tell people to go check out? You have your newsletter, anything else? And we can include links in the show notes to whatever you
Yeah.
want. But yeah, what do you want people go check out?
Yeah, if you want more content from me, my Growth Ways newsletter is a good place to start. I share weekly a free actionable advice for startup scale up apps. And then I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So that's also a great place to reach out if you have a question or to get some little bite-sized pieces of content.
Yeah, your newsletter is great and always tons of insights on LinkedIn. So yeah, everybody should go definitely subscribe and follow.
Thanks so much for
Cool.
having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming. This was great. All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed. Please go to pricepowerpodcast.com to see all the episodes. Go to Spotify and YouTube and give us a subscribe and follow so you don't miss any episodes. All right, talk to you next time.